The knock on my door came at 11 at night, and I already knew something was wrong before I even opened it. I lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the heating barely worked, and nobody important ever came looking for me. So when I saw two men in dark suits standing outside, my hand froze on the lock. "Clara Whitmore?" the taller one asked. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His voice already told me this wasn't a friendly visit. "Who's asking?" I said, keeping the door only half open. "Mr. Marchetti would like a word with you." I had heard that name before. Everyone in this city had heard that name before. Victor Marchetti wasn't the kind of man people talked about loudly. He was the kind of man people avoided even mentioning, as if saying his name too many times might make him appear. "I don't know any Marchetti," I said, which was true, but it didn't matter. The man at the door simply stepped aside and revealed a black car waiting at the curb, engine already running, headlights cutting through the fog like two watching eyes. "He's not asking," the shorter man said. "He's inviting." There is a difference between fear and instinct, and in that moment, mine were fighting each other. Every part of me wanted to shut the door and pretend none of this happened. But another part, the practical part, the part that had counted coins on my kitchen table for the last 3 months trying to figure out how to pay rent, told me to listen first and panic later. "Give me 5 minutes," I said. They gave me 3. The car ride was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of streetlights sliding across the tinted windows. I studied the two men in front, trying to read anything from the backs of their heads, but they gave nothing away. I had grown used to reading people quickly. It was a skill from years of working behind hotel front desks and event counters, watching guests decide within seconds whether they would tip well or complain about everything. But these two were different. There was nothing to read, just silence. We arrived at a private club tucked behind an unmarked door on a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need customers who had to ask where it was. Inside, the lighting was warm and low, the furniture polished, and every person in the room looked like they belonged to old money or dangerous money, sometimes both. I was led to a private office at the back, and there, behind a wide desk of dark wood, sat a man who didn't bother standing up when I entered. Victor Marchetti was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp features and eyes that studied me the way someone studies a contract before signing it. He wore his suit like armor, not decoration. "Sit," he said. I didn't. His eyes flicked up, mildly surprised. Then he gestured to the chair again, this time with a faint curve at the corner of his mouth. "Please." I sat, mostly because my legs were shaking, and I didn't want him to see it. "I need a date," he said, without any warm-up, without any introduction, "for an event this Saturday. Someone convincing. Someone who can hold a conversation, smile at the right moments, and not ask questions she shouldn't." "You could have picked anyone for that," I said. "Why me?" "Because you're not connected to anyone I know," he said. "No family ties, no business partners, no loose ends. And you're clever enough to play the part without needing a script." "You don't know if I'm clever." "I read people for a living," he said. "It keeps me alive." I almost laughed at that, except something about the way he said it made me believe him completely. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," he said simply. "I'm not in the business of forcing anyone into anything they don't want. But I think you'll say yes, because the amount I'm offering will solve whatever problem brought you close enough to broke that you answered your door for 2 strangers at 11 at night." That single sentence landed like a slap, mostly because it was true. "How much?" I asked, hating myself a little for asking so quickly. He slid a folded paper across the desk. I opened it and stared at the number written there, then read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining an extra 0. "For one night?" I asked. "For one night," he confirmed. "You stand beside me. You smile. You speak when spoken to, and you leave when I leave. That's all." It sounded simple, too simple. I had learned enough about deals that sounded too simple to know they usually weren't. "What kind of event is this?" "A private gathering," he said. "Business associates. People who matter to me, and people I need to matter to." "People like you?" "People worse than me," he said. and this time there was no faint smile at all. I studied him carefully, trying to decide if this was a trap, a test, or exactly what it appeared to be. The problem was, even if it was a trap, my empty bank account didn't care about traps. It cared about rent, and food, and the small mountain of unpaid bills sitting on my kitchen counter. "I have one condition," I said. His eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he wasn't used to hearing that word from someone sitting in that chair. "I'm listening." "I don't get pushed around," I said. "Not by you. Not by anyone in that room. I'll play the part, but I'm not a prop. If you introduce me like I'm furniture, I walk out, money or no money." For a long moment, he simply looked at me, and I couldn't tell if he was irritated or amused. Then he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "Interesting," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Most people who sit in that chair only ask how much more they can get. I'm not most people." "No," he said. "I don't think you are." He stood, finally, and extended a hand, not to shake mine, but to help me rise from the chair, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange coming from a man with his reputation. "Saturday," he said, "8 in the evening, a car will come for you. Wear something that says you belong in a room full of people who think they own the world. And what do I get out of humiliating myself trying to look like I belong somewhere I don't? You get paid," he said, "and you get to watch me deal with people who would love nothing more than to see me fail." There was something underneath his words, something almost like an invitation to a private joke I hadn't been let in on yet. "Why does that matter to you?" I asked. "Why do you need someone to prove anything to them?" He studied me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had dropped just slightly, quieter, more careful. "Because in my world, appearances decide who lives comfortably and who doesn't," he said. "A man without a strong partner beside him looks like a man with something to hide. I don't have anything to hide, but perception isn't about truth. It's about what people choose to believe." "So I'm a shield." "You're an image," he corrected. "There's a difference." I wasn't sure I believed that difference mattered as much as he thought it did, but I kept that thought to myself as one of his men walked me back out to the car. The ride home felt shorter than the ride there, maybe because my mind was too busy racing through everything that had just happened to notice the streets passing by. I kept turning the folded paper over in my hands, staring at the number until it stopped looking real. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that I never had the money to fix, and thought about the version of my life, just 1 week ago, a version where nobody like Victor Marchetti even knew my name. Now I was going to spend an entire evening pretending to belong to a world I knew nothing about, standing beside a man who made grown men nervous just by walking into a room. I told myself it was simple. Smile, speak politely, leave when he leaves. But even as I said it, some part of me understood that nothing about a man like Victor Marchetti was ever simple, and by agreeing to Saturday, I had already stepped into something far bigger than one night and one paycheck. I just didn't know yet how big. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, the way Victor Marchetti had studied me, like a puzzle he already knew the answer to, the way his voice never rose but somehow still filled the entire room. I had met plenty of difficult people in my years working hotel counters, wealthy guests who thought their money bought them the right to be cruel, but none of them had that same stillness he carried, the kind that made you feel like the ground under your feet could shift at any second. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was overthinking everything. It was one night, one event. Smile, speak when spoken to, collect the money, and go back to my normal life afterward. I told myself the story so many times that I almost believed it. I spent the next 2 days trying to prepare, though I wasn't entirely sure what preparing for a night like this even meant. I borrowed a book on wine pairings from the library, just in case someone asked my opinion on a glass I would never normally be able to afford. I practiced small talk in front of my bathroom mirror, testing out phrases that sounded confident without sounding rehearsed. I even called my closest friend Margaret, though I didn't tell her the full truth. "A dinner date," I said, when she asked what the money was for. "A business thing. He needed someone presentable." "Presentable," she repeated, clearly unconvinced. "Clara, you sound like you're describing a job interview, not a date." "It kind of is," I admitted. "Just be careful," she said. "Rich men who need to rent company for one night usually have a reason they can't get someone on their own." I laughed it off at the time, but her words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. On Friday evening, a package arrived at my door, delivered by the same quiet man who had knocked on my door 2 nights earlier. Inside was a dress, deep green, simple in design but clearly expensive, along with a small note in neat handwriting that only said one line: "Wear this, or wear something better, but never wear something forgettable." I tried the dress on that night, standing in front of my small mirror, turning slightly to catch the way the fabric moved. It fit as if someone had measured me without me noticing, which unsettled me more than it should have. I wondered how many details about my life Victor Marchetti already had access to before I had even agreed to anything. Saturday arrived faster than I expected, the hours slipping by in a blur of nervous energy and half-finished tasks. I changed my mind about my hair 3 times before settling on something simple, pulled back just enough to look intentional without looking overdone. I studied my reflection in the mirror, trying to see the woman Victor Marchetti expected to walk beside him into a room full of dangerous people. At exactly 8 in the evening, the same black car from before pulled up outside my building, headlights cutting through the evening fog, just like they had that first night. I took one last breath before stepping outside, reminding myself of the only rule I had set for the night ahead. I was not a prop, I was not furniture, and whatever waited for me inside that room, I intended to walk out standing exactly as tall as I walked in. The car stopped in front of a mansion so large it looked like it belonged in a different century, its windows glowing gold against the dark evening sky, and the moment the door opened for me, I understood that whatever I had imagined about tonight was already too small. Rows of expensive cars lined the long driveway, and men in black suits stood at careful intervals along the entrance, watching everyone who approached with the same quiet attention a hawk gives the ground below it. I stepped out, smoothing the green dress with one hand, and immediately felt dozens of eyes turn toward me, before I had even reached the front steps. Victor was already waiting near the entrance, speaking quietly to one of his men, but the moment he noticed me, he stopped mid-sentence and simply watched me walk toward him. For a brief second, something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like surprise, before it disappeared behind his usual calm control. "You look like you belong here," he said, offering his arm. "I feel like I'm about to be thrown out at any moment," I whispered back, taking it anyway. "Then you're doing it correctly," he said. "Everyone in that room feels the same way. They're just better at hiding it." We walked through the front doors together, and the noise of the party hit me instantly. A wall of clinking glasses, low laughter, and quiet conversations happening in every corner of a room too large to belong to any ordinary house. Chandeliers hung overhead like frozen fireworks, and the marble floor beneath us reflected the golden light so perfectly that for a moment it felt like walking across still water. "Remember," Victor said quietly, as we moved deeper into the crowd, "smile, speak only when necessary, and never let anyone see you flinch." "I don't flinch," I said. "Good," he said, "because everyone here is watching for exactly that." He wasn't exaggerating. I felt it almost immediately, the way conversations paused slightly as we passed, the way certain eyes lingered a little too long, measuring, judging, calculating what my presence might mean. A woman in a deep red dress watched us from across the room with an expression that could have cut glass. A tall man near the bar leaned toward his companion and whispered something behind his hand, his eyes never leaving Victor's face. "Friends of yours?" I asked quietly. "Business associates," Victor said. Friends is a strong word in this circle. We were approached almost immediately by an older man, with silver hair, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Ashford, and from the way Victor's posture shifted slightly beside me, I understood this was someone important, someone whose opinion mattered more than most in the room. "Victor," Nathaniel said warmly, though the warmth felt practiced rather than genuine. "I didn't expect you to bring company tonight." "Things change," Victor said simply. Nathaniel's eyes moved to me, studying me the same way Victor had that first night in his office, like I was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And who might this be? Clara, Victor said, before I could answer for myself. She's with me. Something about the way he said it, simple and possessive, made my spine straighten slightly, but I kept my expression pleasant, exactly as I had practiced in my mirror. Lovely to meet you, Clara, Nathaniel said, though his tone carried something underneath the politeness, something that felt like he was already trying to decide what use I might be to him. Tell me, how did a woman like you end up on the arm of a man like Victor? The question felt like a small trap, one designed to see how I would answer, whether I would stumble or hesitate. I smiled instead, keeping my voice light. Luck mostly, I said, though I'm starting to think luck might have been a poor choice of words. Nathaniel laughed, a real laugh this time, and even Victor's mouth twitched slightly at the corner. She's sharp, Nathaniel said to Victor, as if I wasn't standing right there. I like her. She tends to have that effect, Victor said. We moved through the crowd for the next hour, meeting person after person, each conversation carrying its own quiet test, hidden beneath polite words. I learned quickly that everyone in that room spoke in layers, saying one thing while clearly meaning another, and I found myself adjusting to the rhythm faster than I expected, matching wit with wit, deflecting questions I didn't want to answer with humor instead of discomfort. Victor, for his part, remained close beside me the entire time, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back whenever we moved between groups, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like strategy, guiding me exactly where he needed me to be. But as the night went on, something began to shift in his demeanor. Small comments that had felt neutral at first started carrying a slight edge, tiny corrections whispered under his breath when I spoke a little too freely, or laughed a little too loudly for his taste. Careful, he murmured at one point, after I made a joke that drew a genuine laugh from a small cluster of guests. You're not here to be memorable. You're here to be convincing. Those aren't mutually exclusive, I said. Tonight they are, he said, his tone firmer than before. I let it go the first time. I let it go the second time as well, when he steered me away from a conversation I was clearly winning, claiming we needed to greet someone else. But by the third time, when he interrupted me mid-sentence in front of two men discussing their business interests, introducing me with a dismissive wave of his hand, as merely his companion for the evening, something inside me sharpened. She's just here for the evening, he said to the two men, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make it clear I wasn't meant to be taken seriously. The two men chuckled politely and returned their attention to Victor, effectively closing me out of the conversation entirely. I stood there for a moment, feeling heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to anger. I excused myself briefly, moving toward a quiet corner near tall glass doors that led out to a candlelit garden, needing a moment to steady my breathing before I said something I might regret in front of a room full of dangerous strangers. A woman approached me there, the same one in the deep red dress who had watched us earlier from across the room. Up close, she had sharp eyes and an even sharper smile, the kind that suggested she had survived plenty of rooms like this one. You're new, she said simply, not unkindly. Is it that obvious? Only to people who know what to look for, she said. I'm Adeline. I used to stand exactly where you're standing. With Victor? With a man just like him, she said. They all come from the same mold, charming when it benefits them, dismissive when it doesn't. He'll keep doing that all night, chipping away at you in small pieces, until you either shrink or you don't. And if I don't shrink? Adeline studied me for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind her eyes. Then you'll be the most interesting thing that's happened in this room in years, she said. Men like Victor Marchetti aren't afraid of enemies. They're afraid of anyone who refuses to be controlled. Her words settled into my chest, like a lit match dropped onto dry paper. I thanked her quietly and returned to the party, finding Victor near the center of the room, deep in conversation with Nathaniel Ashford and two other men I hadn't met yet. He glanced at me as I approached, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, before continuing his conversation, as if I wasn't there at all. I stood beside him silently for several minutes, listening to the conversation shift from business investments to something more personal, more probing, clearly designed to test the strength of whatever image Victor had built around himself tonight. "Tell me, Victor," Nathaniel said eventually, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Does your lovely companion here actually understand anything about the world you operate in, or is she simply decoration for the evening?" The room around us seemed to quiet slightly, several nearby conversations pausing just enough to listen for the answer. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained smooth. "She understands exactly what she needs to understand." "Which is?" Nathaniel pressed, clearly enjoying himself. "That some things are better left unspoken," Victor said, his eyes briefly flicking toward me with a warning I couldn't mistake. I felt every eye nearby settle on me now, waiting to see how the decorative woman on Victor Marchetti's arm would respond to being spoken about, as though she had no thoughts of her own. I smiled, sweet and calm, and let my voice carry just enough for the small crowd around us to hear clearly. "Actually," I said, "I understand plenty. For instance, I understand that a man who needs to remind everyone in the room how powerful he is usually isn't as powerful as he wants people to believe." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the small group around us. Nathaniel's eyebrows lifted in surprised delight, and somewhere behind me, I heard someone stifle a laugh. Victor turned to look at me fully now, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carrying a warning sharp enough to cut glass. "Clara," he said quietly, a clear edge beneath the calm. "What?" I said, keeping my voice light, almost playful, though my heart pounded loudly enough that I was certain he could hear it. "I'm simply saying what everyone here is already thinking." The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise the party had made all evening, and I realized, standing there in the middle of that golden room, that I had just crossed a line there was no walking back from. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the string quartet playing softly near the far wall seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire room had narrowed down to the small space between Victor and me. Nathaniel Ashford's eyes darted between the two of us, clearly delighted by the sudden tension he had helped create, though I doubted even he expected it to escalate this quickly. Victor's expression remained carefully composed, but I had spent enough time studying him over the last few days to notice the subtle tightening around his jaw, the almost invisible clench of his hand at his side. He was not a man used to being challenged, and certainly not in front of an audience like this one. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his voice carrying a calm that felt deliberately controlled, "we should discuss this privately." "Why?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost curious. Everyone seems quite invested in the conversation already. A soft chuckle rippled through a few of the guests standing nearby, quickly suppressed, but not quiet enough to go unnoticed. Nathaniel's smile widened, clearly enjoying the show far more than the business conversation that had started the evening. "She has spirit," Nathaniel said, turning toward Victor with an expression that bordered on amusement. "I can see why you chose her." "I didn't choose her for spirit," Victor said, his eyes still fixed on me. "Then perhaps you should have," I said simply. The words hung in the air between us, and for a brief moment, something shifted in Victor's expression. A flicker that looked almost like reluctant respect, hidden beneath the frustration. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the same guarded control he wore, like a second skin. He excused us both from the small group with practiced smoothness, his hand finding my elbow with a grip firm enough to guide me away, without appearing forceful to anyone watching. We moved toward the same quiet corner near the garden doors, where I had spoken with Adeline earlier, though this time the space felt far less private, several curious eyes following our path across the room. "What exactly was that?" Victor asked, once we were far enough from the crowd, his voice low and tight. "That was me refusing to be talked about like I wasn't standing right there," I said. "You embarrassed me in front of Nathaniel Ashford," he said. "Do you understand who that man is?" "I understand he enjoyed every second of it," I said, "which tells me you embarrassed yourself long before I said a single word." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something other than calm control behind them, something closer to genuine surprise at being spoken to so directly. "You were hired to smile and stay quiet," he said. "I was hired to be convincing," I corrected. And nothing about a silent, decorative woman standing beside a man like you would have convinced anyone in that room of anything. He studied me for a long moment, and I forced myself to hold his gaze, refusing to look away first, even as my pulse hammered beneath my calm expression. Somewhere behind him, the party continued, laughter and conversation swelling back to its normal volume now that the momentary tension had passed, though I suspected plenty of eyes were still watching us from a careful distance. "You have no idea what you just started," Victor said finally, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "Then explain it to me," I said, because from where I'm standing, all I did was refuse to be treated like furniture. For a moment, I thought he might simply turn and walk away, ending the conversation the same way he ended most things, with quiet control and distance. Instead, he exhaled slowly, glancing briefly toward the crowd before returning his attention to me. "Nathaniel Ashford has been waiting for an opportunity like this for months," he said. "A crack in my composure, a moment of weakness he can use to convince others that I'm no longer as steady as I once was. Tonight, you handed him exactly that." "Or," I said, "I handed him a version of you that isn't afraid to be challenged, which might matter more than you think." Victor's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet tension between us thick enough to feel physical. "You're either the smartest decision I've made all year," he said finally, "or the most dangerous one." "Maybe it's both," I said. Before he could respond, one of his men appeared quietly at his side, leaning close to murmur something into his ear. Victor's expression shifted instantly, the softness disappearing behind a mask of sharp focus. "We need to go back in," he said. "Now." "What's happening?" "Something you need to see," he said, already turning back toward the golden light of the ballroom, his pace quicker than before, urgency replacing the calm control he had carried all evening. I followed close behind him, weaving through the crowd once more, aware of curious glances following our path, though now they carried a different weight, less amusement, and more genuine curiosity about what might unfold next. Whatever had shifted in that quiet corner near the garden doors, I understood clearly that the night was far from over, and the real test of the evening was only just beginning. Victor led me back into the ballroom at a pace that made it clear something had gone seriously wrong, his men falling into formation around us like a wall of black suits, and the moment we crossed back into the golden light, I understood exactly why. Nathaniel Ashford stood near the center of the room, a glass of wine in his hand, addressing a growing circle of guests with the confident ease of a man delivering a speech he had rehearsed for weeks. His voice carried clearly across the space, deliberately loud enough to draw attention from every corner of the party. "And it seems our friend Victor has been having some difficulties lately," Nathaniel was saying, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Missed shipments, unhappy partners, a few too many questions from people who used to trust him without hesitation. Some might call it bad luck. I call it a pattern." The circle around him murmured, some faces amused, others carefully neutral, clearly unwilling to pick a side until they understood which way the wind was blowing. Victor's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at my elbow as we approached, though his expression remained carefully composed. "Careful, Nathaniel," Victor said, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmurs. "Rumors have a way of turning back on the people who spread them." "Is that a threat?" Nathaniel asked, feigning surprise, though the smile never left his face. "It's an observation," Victor said. "Well, here's another observation," Nathaniel said, turning slightly to address the wider crowd now gathering around them. "A man who can't keep his own house in order shouldn't be trusted to manage anyone else's business. And from what I understand, Victor's house has been rather unsteady lately." I felt the shift in the room immediately, the way conversations quieted, the way people leaned subtly closer, sensing blood in the water. This wasn't simply business rivalry playing out in polite conversation anymore. This was a public challenge, carefully staged in front of an audience, large enough to make it impossible for Victor to ignore. "You want to discuss business in front of a room full of people who have nothing to do with it?" Victor asked, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "I want to discuss trust," Nathaniel said, "something that seems to be running thin around you lately. First your supplier troubles last month, then that unfortunate situation with the shipment everyone's still talking about, and now," he gestured toward me with his wine glass, a small, deliberate motion, bringing along a woman nobody has ever heard of, who apparently feels comfortable insulting you in public. Tell me, Victor, does that sound like a man in control of his affairs, or a man losing his grip? A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the crowd, and I felt heat rise in my chest again, not from embarrassment this time, but from something closer to fury. Nathaniel wasn't simply testing Victor anymore. He was using me as a weapon against him, twisting my earlier words into evidence of Victor's supposed weakness. Victor's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. The recognition of a trap closing slowly around him, in front of an audience that would remember every second of this exchange. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes shift toward me now, waiting to see whether I would shrink under the sudden scrutiny, whether the woman who had spoken so confidently in a quiet corner would crumble now that the stakes had grown so much larger. I didn't shrink. Actually, I said, stepping slightly forward, my voice clear enough to carry across the sudden quiet. I think you've misunderstood what happened earlier. Nathaniel turned toward me, his eyebrows raised in mild surprise, clearly not expecting the decorative woman to speak up again so soon. Is that so? I didn't insult Victor because he's weak, I said. I insulted him because he made the mistake of introducing me like I had nothing worth contributing, which, respectfully, is exactly the same mistake you're making right now. A few surprised murmurs rippled through the nearby guests, and Nathaniel's confident expression faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, forcing a small laugh. Charming, he said, but this conversation isn't about you. No, I agreed. It's about you trying to convince a room full of powerful people that Victor is unstable, using rumors you can't actually prove, and a woman you assumed would be too intimidated to correct you. The room had gone almost completely silent now. Every conversation nearby paused entirely, attention locked on the unexpected exchange unfolding in the center of the party. I could feel Victor's eyes on me, sharp and unreadable, though he made no move to interrupt. You seem very confident for someone who was hired for the evening, Nathaniel said, his tone shifting, sharper now, less playful. I am confident, I said, because unlike you, I don't need to invent stories to make myself look important. Invent stories? Nathaniel repeated, his voice rising slightly. The shipment everyone's still talking about, I said, remembering the small detail Adeline had mentioned earlier, while we spoke near the garden doors. A fragment of gossip she had shared almost in passing, about a rival's failed attempt to intercept goods that never actually belonged to him. The one you're implying was Victor's failure. From what I understand, that shipment was never his to begin with. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose name you conveniently left out of your little speech. Nathaniel's confident expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for those closest to him to notice the shift. That's not accurate, he said quickly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. Then correct me, I said. Tell everyone here exactly whose shipment it was, and why you've been telling a different story for weeks. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, and I watched Nathaniel's eyes dart briefly toward a few of his own associates standing nearby, searching for support that didn't come. Several of them shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their wine glasses far more interesting than the conversation happening in front of them. This is absurd, Nathaniel said finally, though his voice had lost the commanding tone it carried just minutes earlier. I don't need to explain myself to some woman Victor picked up for the evening. Then don't, I said calmly. But everyone here just watched you avoid answering a simple question, which tells them everything they need to know about whether your earlier claims were true. The murmurs around us shifted now, subtly but unmistakably, the earlier amusement at Victor's expense, replaced by something closer to skepticism, directed at Nathaniel instead. I could see it in the way certain guests exchanged quiet glances, in the way a few edged slightly away from Nathaniel's side, as if distancing themselves from whatever damage was unfolding. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might attempt some final counterattack, some clever remark designed to regain control of the narrative. Instead, he simply forced a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes at all. "Enjoy your evening," he said stiffly, before turning and walking away, his earlier audience already beginning to disperse in different directions, quiet conversations resuming as though the entire confrontation had never happened. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering loudly enough that I could hear it in my own ears, aware that every remaining eye in the room had shifted toward Victor and me now, waiting to see what would happen next. Victor turned to face me slowly, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I genuinely didn't know whether I was about to be praised or removed from the party entirely. "How did you know that detail about the shipment?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the sharp edge from earlier. "I overheard it," I said honestly. "From a woman named Adeline, near the garden doors. I didn't even realize it might matter until Nathaniel brought the shipment up himself." Victor studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that I couldn't quite identify, somewhere between surprise and calculation. "You just publicly humiliated one of the most dangerous men in this room," he said. "I thought you'd be angry," I admitted. "I am," he said. Then, after a pause, "I'm also impressed, which is a combination I don't experience often." Before I could respond, a small crowd began approaching us, several guests who had clearly recalculated their opinion of the evening's events entirely. A woman in silver introduced herself warmly, complimenting my composure. A man near the bar raised his glass slightly in my direction, a subtle gesture of respect I hadn't expected to receive from anyone in this room. Adeline appeared beside me a few minutes later, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "I told you," she said quietly, "just for me to hear. Men like Nathaniel are only powerful until someone refuses to be intimidated by them." "I didn't plan any of that," I admitted. "No," she said, "but you handled it exactly like someone who belongs in this world, whether you intended to or not." I glanced toward Victor, who was now speaking quietly with two men I hadn't met yet, though his eyes kept flicking back toward me every few moments, something unfamiliar behind his usual guarded expression. The rest of the evening passed differently than it had begun. Conversations that had once felt like careful tests now felt almost welcoming. Guests approaching not to measure me against some invisible standard, but out of genuine curiosity about the woman who had stood her ground against Nathaniel Ashford without flinching. By the time Victor finally guided me back toward the entrance, the party winding down around us, I felt entirely different than I had walking in hours earlier. I had come into that mansion feeling like an outsider wearing borrowed confidence, and I was leaving as someone the entire room had watched command respect through nothing but words and steady nerves. "You didn't answer my earlier question," Victor said quietly, as we stepped outside into the cool night air, the black car already waiting at the curb. "Which question? Whether tonight made you the smartest decision I've made all year, or the most dangerous one?" I considered the question carefully, watching the way the moonlight caught the sharp lines of his face, the guarded calm slowly returning to his expression now that we were away from watching eyes. "I think," I said slowly, "you're about to find out that it's both." Something flickered across his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that I noticed it clearly. He opened the car door for me himself this time, rather than letting one of his men do it, a small gesture that felt heavier than it should have. As the car pulled away from the mansion, leaving the golden lights behind us, I realized that whatever simple arrangement I had agreed to 3 days earlier had already changed into something far more complicated, something neither of us had fully anticipated when this began. And judging by the look on Victor's face as he watched the city lights pass by the window, I wasn't the only one who felt it. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between us, as the mansion disappeared behind rows of tall trees lining the private road. I kept replaying the confrontation in my mind, the way Nathaniel's confident expression had cracked the moment he realized he couldn't answer a simple question in front of an audience that had already begun turning against him. "You took a real risk back there," Victor said finally, breaking the silence. "If you had been wrong about that shipment, Nathaniel would have used it to bury both of us." "I know," I said. "I didn't have time to think it through carefully. I just remembered what Adeline said, and it felt important enough to use." "Most people freeze in moments like that," he said. "They calculate the risk too carefully and end up saying nothing at all, which is often worse than saying the wrong thing. Is that what you would have done?" "I would have handled it differently," he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain his way would have worked as well as mine had. "Differently doesn't necessarily mean better," I said. He glanced at me then, and for the first time since I had met him 3 days earlier, something like genuine amusement crossed his features, quick and unguarded, before it disappeared again. "No," he admitted, "perhaps not." The car wound through quiet streets, passing rows of dark shop fronts and empty sidewalks, the city settling into the stillness of late night. I found myself studying his reflection in the window glass, trying to reconcile the calculating, controlled man from his office 3 days ago with the quieter version sitting beside me now, someone who seemed almost thoughtful in the aftermath of everything that had happened. "Nathaniel won't forget tonight," Victor said eventually. "Men like him don't handle public embarrassment well. He'll look for ways to retaliate, probably sooner rather than later." "Should I be worried?" "You should be aware," he said. "There's a difference. That's not particularly comforting." "I didn't say it to comfort you," he said. "I said it because you deserve to understand exactly what you stepped into tonight, rather than assuming it ends the moment this car reaches your apartment." I considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of them settle over me, the same way the cool night air had settled over the mansion's garden earlier. Whatever simple arrangement I had imagined 3 days ago, standing in his office with a folded paper full of numbers in my hand, had clearly evolved into something with far more consequences than either of us had anticipated. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You could have just dropped me off and let me figure it out on my own." "Because it wouldn't be honest," he said. "And after tonight, I think you've earned more honesty than most people in my life receive." The admission surprised me more than I expected, and for a moment, neither of us spoke again, the quiet settling comfortably between us, instead of feeling tense the way it had during our first car ride together. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "With Nathaniel? With tonight? With all of it?" "I don't know yet," Victor admitted, which isn't something I say often. "Is that a bad thing?" "It depends," he said, "on whether you're planning to disappear back into your quiet life tomorrow morning, or whether tonight changed something neither of us expected it to change." I didn't answer immediately, watching the streetlights slide past the window instead, turning his question over carefully in my mind. 3 days ago, I had walked into his office needing nothing more than enough money to cover rent and bills. Now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of a night that had reshaped an entire room's opinion of him, I wasn't entirely sure a quiet life was something I still wanted, or something that was even possible anymore. "I don't have an answer for you yet either," I said finally. "Fair enough," he said, something like respect flickering behind his tired eyes. The car eventually pulled up outside my building, the same worn brick front and dim streetlight I had walked past 100 times before tonight, though everything about the world I returned to now felt slightly different, slightly heavier with possibility and risk both. Victor walked me to my door himself, waving off the man who moved to follow us, and for a moment, we stood together in the quiet hallway outside my apartment, the golden chaos of the mansion feeling like a distant memory already. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for tonight." "You're welcome," I said, "though I imagine you're not used to saying that to people you hire for an evening." "No," he admitted, "I'm not." He studied me for a long moment before turning to leave, though he paused at the top of the stairwell, glancing back with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This isn't over," he said. "Not the danger, and not whatever this was tonight." "I didn't think it would be," I said. He nodded once, then disappeared down the stairwell, leaving me standing alone outside my apartment door, replaying every second of the evening in my mind, uncertain whether I had just survived something dangerous, or simply stepped into the beginning of something far more complicated than money ever could have prepared me for. The knock came again 3 days later, but this time, I opened the door without hesitation, already recognizing the quiet man standing outside, before he said a single word. "Mr. Marchetti requests your presence," he said. Immediately, "Is something wrong?" He didn't share the details with me, the man said, though the tightness around his eyes told me clearly enough that whatever was happening wasn't good news. I grabbed my coat and followed him down to the waiting car, my mind already racing through every possibility, most of them involving Nathaniel Ashford and whatever retaliation Victor had warned me about after the gala. The ride felt longer this time, tension filling the silence in a way it hadn't during our previous drives together. We arrived not at the private club from before, but at a modest office building tucked between two larger structures downtown, the kind of place that gave nothing away about the business conducted inside it. I was led up to the 4th floor, into a room where Victor stood near a window overlooking the street below, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen since our first meeting. "What happened?" I asked, before he even turned to face me. "Nathaniel filed a formal complaint with the council this morning," Victor said, finally turning around. "Othing is accusing me of falsifying records related to the shipment you mentioned at the gala. He's using your comment as evidence that I panicked and tried to cover something up." "That's not what happened," I said. "I was simply pointing out that he was lying." "I know that," Victor said. "But perception matters more than truth in this world, and right now, several people are starting to believe his version of events instead of mine. So fix it," I said. "Tell them the truth." "It's not that simple," he said, running a hand through his hair, a rare crack in his usual composure. "The council doesn't want truth. They want confidence. And right now, thanks to Nathaniel's carefully worded accusation, confidence in me is exactly what's slipping." I studied him for a long moment, watching the tension radiate from every line of his posture, and something inside me hardened with a quiet resolve I hadn't expected to feel this strongly. "Then we give them confidence," I said. "How?" "The same way we did at the gala," I said, "publicly, in front of everyone who matters, before Nathaniel has time to twist this any further." Victor studied me carefully, something calculating behind his tired eyes. "You want to walk back into that world voluntarily, after everything I warned you about?" "I walked into it voluntarily the first time too," I said. "The only difference now is I understand exactly what I'm walking into." For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying me the way he had that very first night in his office, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept shifting every time he looked away. "There's a council meeting tomorrow evening," he said finally. "Formal, structured. Every important figure in the city will be present. If Nathaniel's accusation gains any more ground before then, I could lose standing. I've spent years building." "Then let's make sure it doesn't," I said. He studied me a moment longer before nodding slowly, something shifting in his expression that looked almost like gratitude, though he quickly masked it behind his usual composed exterior. "I need to know everything about that shipment," I said. "Every detail, not just the fragment Adeline mentioned in passing. If I'm going to defend you in front of people who already doubt you, I need facts, not instinct." Victor moved to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with documents, spreading them across the surface between us. Over the next several hours, he walked me through every detail of the shipment in question, the paper trail proving it had never belonged to his organization, the quiet history of tension between his network and Nathaniel's that stretched back years before I had ever entered the picture. "Why didn't you present this evidence already?" I asked, studying a particular document that clearly outlined the shipment's true ownership. "Because presenting evidence looks defensive," Victor said. "And in this world, defending yourself too eagerly makes people believe you have something to hide, even when you don't. So instead you just let the accusation sit there, gaining weight with every passing day?" "I was formulating a response," he said, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "Careful responses take time. Careful responses also lose to fast ones," I said. "Nathaniel isn't waiting for you to be careful. He's counting on it." Victor studied me for a long moment, something unreadable behind his tired eyes, before a slow, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You've spent 3 days around this world, and you're already lecturing me on strategy." "I'm not lecturing," I said. "I'm pointing out the obvious." "Same thing, coming from you," he said, though there was no real irritation behind the words this time, something warmer instead, something that felt dangerously close to genuine fondness. We spent the rest of the evening preparing, Victor walking me through the structure of tomorrow's council meeting, the personalities involved, the delicate balance of power that kept the entire fragile system functioning. I absorbed every detail carefully, building a mental map of a world I had only glimpsed briefly at the gala, understanding now just how much depended on tomorrow evening going exactly right. "There's something else you should know," Victor said quietly, as the evening stretched later, the office growing dim around us, except for the small lamp on his desk. What? Nathaniel isn't only targeting my reputation, he said. He's made it clear he considers you a factor now too. If tomorrow doesn't go well, you may become a target as well, not just me. The words settled heavily in my chest, though I refused to let the fear show on my face. I understood the risk when I agreed to this the first time. This is different, Victor said. The first time, you were an unknown woman standing beside me for one evening. Now, you're someone Nathaniel has publicly acknowledged as a threat to his credibility. That changes things. Are you asking me to walk away? I'm asking if you understand what staying means, he said, his voice quieter now, more careful than I had heard it before. I considered the question honestly, weighing the fear against something else entirely, something that had been growing steadily since that first confrontation at the gala, a sense of purpose I hadn't expected to find in a world this dangerous. I understand, I said finally, and I'm staying anyway. Something shifted behind Victor's eyes then, gratitude mixed with something else I couldn't quite name, something that made the air between us feel charged in a way it hadn't before. Then we prepare properly, he said, his voice steadying, resolve replacing the earlier tension. Tomorrow, we walk into that room together, and we make sure Nathaniel Ashford regrets ever underestimating either of us. We worked late into the night, refining every detail of the argument we would present, anticipating every possible counterattack Nathaniel might attempt, until the documents spread across Victor's desk told a story so clearly true that no amount of clever rhetoric could easily dismiss it. By the time the car finally dropped me back at my apartment, exhaustion settling deep into my bones, I understood clearly that tomorrow evening would decide far more than Victor's standing within his dangerous world. It would decide whether the version of myself who had walked confidently into that mansion 3 days earlier was someone I intended to remain, or whether fear would finally catch up with the confidence I had borrowed, just long enough to survive one golden evening. I fell asleep that night with the documents Victor had given me spread across my kitchen table, rehearsing arguments in my mind long after my eyes had closed, preparing myself for a confrontation that would either cement everything we had built over these strange few days, or shatter it entirely in front of the very people whose opinions decided who thrived in this world, and who quietly disappeared from it instead. I woke early the next morning, the documents still scattered across my table exactly as I had left them, and for a long moment, I simply sat there staring at them, trying to convince myself that everything from the past 3 days had actually happened. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. 3 words only. Car arrives soon. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark suit instead of anything resembling the green dress from the gala, understanding instinctively that today required a different kind of presentation, something closer to competence than charm. When the car arrived, Victor was already inside, reviewing a final stack of papers, his expression sharper and more focused than I had seen it since our very first meeting. "You look ready," he said, glancing up as I settled into the seat beside him. "I feel like I might be sick," I admitted. "That's normal," he said. "Anyone who tells you they're not nervous before a council meeting like this is either lying or has nothing left to lose." "Which one are you?" "Both, depending on the hour," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face before disappearing again. We reviewed the arguments one final time during the ride, Victor quizzing me on details from the shipment documents, testing how quickly I could recall specific dates and names under pressure. I stumbled twice, correcting myself immediately both times, and by the third round, I answered every question smoothly, the facts settling firmly into memory exactly where I needed them. "Good," he said, after my final answer. "That's good enough." "Good enough isn't the same as certain," I said. "Nothing about today is certain," he said, "but preparation is the closest thing we have to controlling what happens next." The car eventually stopped outside a tall stone building near the center of the city, far more imposing than the mansion from the gala, its entrance guarded by men who checked names against a list before allowing anyone through the heavy doors. Victor's name was on that list, though I noticed the guard's eyes flick toward me with obvious uncertainty before Victor simply stated that I was with him, and the man stepped aside without further question. Inside, the building felt cold in a way the gala never had, all marble and shadow instead of golden light and laughter, a room built for judgment rather than celebration. A long table stood at the center of the main hall, several figures already seated around it, their expressions unreadable as we entered, and I felt the weight of their collective attention settle over me instantly. Nathaniel Ashford sat near the head of the table, his expression carefully composed, though I caught the faint flicker of surprise when he noticed me walking in beside Victor, rather than staying safely away, as he had likely hoped. "Victor," Nathaniel said smoothly, rising slightly from his seat in a show of false courtesy. "And Clara, of course. I wasn't certain you would have the confidence to return after everything you started at the gala." "I wasn't aware confidence was something in short supply for me," I said calmly, taking the seat Victor gestured toward without hesitation. A few quiet chuckles rippled around the table, and Nathaniel's expression tightened slightly, before smoothing back into its usual practiced calm. The meeting began shortly after, the presiding figure at the head of the table calling the room to order, and I felt my pulse quicken as the formal accusation against Victor was read aloud for the assembled council, each word landing heavier than the last in the cold, echoing hall. I glanced sideways at Victor as the accusation finished being read, watching for any crack in his composure, but he sat perfectly still, hands folded calmly on the table in front of him, giving nothing away to the watching council members. I understood then that this stillness was its own kind of performance, the same way my smile at the gala had been, both of us wearing whatever expression the moment required to survive it. The presiding council member, an older woman with silver hair and an expression carved from stone, turned her attention toward Victor first. "You have the opportunity to respond to these accusations. I would advise you to choose your words carefully." "I intend to," Victor said, his voice steady and calm despite the tension radiating from every other person seated around that long table. He gestured toward me slightly, a small motion barely noticeable unless you were watching closely, and I understood immediately that this was my moment, the reason he had spent the entire previous night walking me through every detail of the shipment documents, until the facts lived in my memory as clearly as my own name. I straightened in my seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room settle on me, and reminded myself of the same lesson I had learned at the gala. Fear was allowed, shrinking was not. "With respect," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the cold marble hall, "I'd like to walk this council through exactly what the documentation shows, because I believe several details relevant to this accusation have been conveniently left out of Nathaniel's version of events." Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and across the table, I saw the presiding council member lean forward slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing with interest rather than dismissal. "Go on," she said. And for the first time since walking into that cold stone building, I felt something steady settle beneath my nervous heartbeat, a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I intended to make sure the truth was the last thing standing in that room. I laid out the documents one by one across the long marble table, my hands steady despite the nervous hammering of my heart, and began walking the council through every detail Victor and I had reviewed the night before. "The shipment in question," I said, sliding the first document toward the presiding council member, "was registered under a separate ownership entirely, weeks before the date Nathaniel claims it disappeared under Victor's supervision. Here is the original registration, dated and signed." The silver-haired woman studied the paper carefully, her sharp eyes moving line by line before passing it to the council member seated beside her. A quiet murmur moved around the table as more documents circulated, each one reinforcing the timeline I had memorized late into the previous night. "This is fabricated," Nathaniel said quickly, though his voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried during our first confrontation at the gala. "Then perhaps you can explain why the signature matches records already on file with this very council," I said, sliding a second document across the table, dated 3 months before the shipment Nathaniel claims Victor mishandled. Nathaniel's composure cracked slightly further, his eyes darting toward a few of his own associates seated nearby, searching again for support that clearly wasn't coming this time. Several council members exchanged quiet glances, their expressions shifting from cautious neutrality toward something closer to skepticism, directed squarely at him. "Even if the ownership records are accurate," Nathaniel said, recovering some composure, That doesn't explain the missing goods themselves, which Victor's organization was responsible for transporting. You're right, I said calmly. It doesn't, which is why I brought this. I slid a third document forward. A transport log detailing the exact route and handling chain for the shipment in question. Each signature and timestamp accounted for clearly. According to this log, I continued, the shipment was transferred out of Victor's custody 2 days before it went missing, into the custody of a separate transport contractor. A contractor. I paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to build. Who happens to work exclusively for your organization, Nathaniel? The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that felt loud in its own way, pressing against my ears as every council member turned their full attention toward Nathaniel, waiting for a response he clearly didn't have ready. Nathaniel started, then stopped, his jaw working silently for a moment before he managed to continue. That contractor works independently. Their affiliation with my organization is coincidental. Is it? I asked. Because according to the payment records I also have here, I slid a fourth document forward. That same contractor received a payment from your accounts 3 days after the shipment disappeared, an amount that matches almost exactly the estimated value of the missing goods. The presiding council member's eyebrows rose sharply as she studied the payment record, then looked up at Nathaniel with an expression that had shifted entirely from earlier neutrality into something far colder. Explain this, she said simply. Nathaniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly searching for an explanation that didn't exist, or at least one he couldn't produce quickly enough under the weight of the entire council's scrutiny. The silence stretched long enough to become its own answer, more damning than anything I could have said. I believe, Victor said finally, speaking for the first time since the documents had begun circulating, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge now, that the accusation brought against me today was never about missing shipments or falsified records. It was about removing a rival before he could expose exactly what I just watched Clara lay out clearly for this entire council. This is a setup, Nathaniel said, though his voice lacked any real conviction now. No, the silver-haired council member said, her tone final and unforgiving. This is evidence, something your accusation against Victor conspicuously lacked from the beginning. She looked around the table at her fellow council members, several of whom nodded slowly in agreement, the earlier tension in the room shifting entirely, redirected now toward Nathaniel instead of Victor. This council will need time to review these documents formally, she said, but I believe it's clear enough for today's purposes that the accusation against Victor Marchetti is, at minimum, built on incomplete information, and at worst, a deliberate attempt to damage his standing through fabricated circumstances. Nathaniel said nothing further, his earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by something closer to controlled panic, as he realized the room had turned against him entirely, the same way it had turned against Victor briefly at the gala, except this time, there would be no clever recovery waiting for him. The meeting concluded shortly after, the council agreeing to formally investigate Nathaniel's connections to the missing shipment rather than pursue any further action against Victor. As the room slowly emptied, several council members approached Victor directly, offering quiet words of support they clearly hadn't been willing to voice before today's evidence had been laid bare in front of them. I stood back slightly during these conversations, watching Victor navigate the sudden shift in atmosphere with practiced calm, though I caught him glancing toward me more than once, something warm and unreadable behind his composed expression. Adeline appeared beside me as the hall continued emptying, her sharp eyes bright with obvious satisfaction. I told you, she said quietly, echoing the same words she had spoken to me at the gala. Men like Nathaniel only survive as long as nobody bothers to look closely enough. I got lucky, I admitted. If Victor hadn't shared those documents with me last night, I wouldn't have had anything to bring today. Luck is what people call preparation, when they don't want to admit how much work actually went into it, Adeline said, a knowing smile playing at her lips before she disappeared into the thinning crowd. Once the hall had mostly cleared, Victor finally approached me directly, his expression softer now than I had seen it at any point since we first met in his office nearly a week earlier. You saved everything today, he said quietly. We saved everything, I corrected. I just delivered what you already built. Still, he said, I don't think anyone else could have delivered it the way you did, calm enough to make every word land exactly where it needed to. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, though this time, it had nothing to do with anger or nervousness, something entirely different, settling warmly in its place instead. What happens now? I asked. With Nathaniel? With the council? With all of it? Nathaniel's influence will weaken considerably after today, Victor said. It may take weeks or months for the full consequences to unfold, but the damage to his credibility is already done. As for the council, my standing is more secure now than it's been in months. And us? I asked, the question slipping out before I fully decided to ask it. Victor studied me for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual guarded composure, a rare crack in the careful control he wore like armor every day of his life. I hadn't planned on there being an us when I first knocked on your door, he admitted. I needed a convincing companion for one evening, nothing more complicated than that. And now? Now, he said slowly, I find myself considering an arrangement that extends well beyond one evening, if you're willing to consider it as well. What kind of arrangement? I asked, though something in his tone already told me this wasn't about money anymore. The kind where you stand beside me, not because I'm paying you to, he said, but because you choose to, understanding exactly what that means, exactly how dangerous this world can be, and deciding it's still worth staying in it. I considered his words carefully, thinking back to the frightened woman who had opened her apartment door to two strangers just over a week ago, comparing her to the woman standing in this cold marble hall now, who had just dismantled a dangerous man's carefully constructed lies in front of an entire council of powerful strangers. I already decided that, I said quietly, back when I told you I was staying, even after you warned me about the risk. Something shifted in Victor's expression then, relief mixed with a warmth I hadn't seen from him before, his usual careful composure softening into something far more genuine. Then I suppose, he said, we should discuss the terms of this new arrangement properly, somewhere considerably less cold than this hall. I know a decent bakery near my apartment, I said. Terrible coffee, but the pastries make up for it. A real smile crossed his face then, unguarded and surprisingly warm, the first one I had seen since meeting him that felt entirely unpracticed. That sounds perfect, he said. We left the stone building together, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the tension of the past week finally beginning to loosen from my shoulders. The car waited for us at the curb, though this time, Victor opened the door for me without any of his men stepping in to do it first, a small gesture that felt like the clearest sign yet of how much had changed since that very first knock on my apartment door. As we drove away from the council hall, leaving behind the cold marble and the collapsed remains of Nathaniel's carefully built accusation, I thought about how strange it was that a single evening, meant to last only a few hours in exchange for a folded piece of paper full of numbers, had reshaped my entire life so completely. I had walked into Victor Marchetti's world as a stranger, hired to smile and stay quiet, expected to disappear the moment the night ended. Instead, I had found my voice in the middle of a golden room full of dangerous people, used it again in a cold hall full of powerful strangers, and somewhere between those two moments, I had become someone Victor Marchetti no longer paid to stand beside him. I had become someone he genuinely wanted there. And as the city passed by outside the car window, sunlight catching against familiar streets I had walked 1,000 times before as an entirely different woman, I understood clearly that whatever came next, whatever dangers still waited in the world I had stepped into, I intended to face them exactly the way I had faced Nathaniel Ashford twice already. Standing tall, speaking clearly, and refusing, always, to shrink. The bakery beneath my apartment was quiet when we arrived, the afternoon rush long since passed, leaving only the warm smell of fresh bread and the soft hum of an old radio playing somewhere behind the counter. Victor looked slightly out of place among the simple wooden tables and mismatched chairs, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the worn charm of the small shop, but he settled into the seat across from me without complaint, as if the unfamiliar setting didn't bother him at all. "This is not what I expected," he said, glancing around at the chalkboard menu and the faded photographs lining the walls. "Did you expect something fancier?" I expected somewhere with cloth napkins, at minimum, he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. You'll survive, I said, sliding a warm pastry across the table toward him. Consider it part of your education in the world outside mansions and council halls. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully, and I watched something in his shoulders loosen slightly, the careful tension he carried everywhere finally easing in the quiet corner of an ordinary bakery. You were right, he admitted after a moment. The coffee is terrible. Told you. We sat together for a long while after that, the conversation drifting away from council meetings and dangerous rivals entirely, settling instead into smaller things, quieter things, the kind of conversation two people have when they're finally allowed to simply exist together, without an audience measuring every word. I learned that Victor had grown up nothing like the powerful figure he had become, that his calm control had been built slowly over years of necessity, rather than natural temperament. He learned that I had spent most of my adult life working quietly behind counters, watching people from a careful distance, never once imagining that distance might someday close entirely. What made you decide to knock on my door in the first place? I asked eventually. Out of everyone in this city, why me? Instinct, mostly, he admitted. I asked around quietly, looking for someone unconnected to my usual circles, someone sharp enough to think on her feet. Your name came up more than once, people mentioning how you handled difficult situations at the hotel counter, without losing your composure. I didn't realize I had a reputation. A small one, he said. Enough to catch my attention. And now? Now I think instinct served me better than I expected, he said, something warm settling behind his tired eyes. The afternoon slipped by slowly, comfortably, neither of us in any particular hurry to return to the world of council meetings and dangerous rivalries, waiting just outside the bakery's warm windows. Eventually, as the light outside began shifting toward evening, Victor reached across the small table, his hand resting lightly over mine, a gesture far gentler than anything I had seen from him during the past chaotic week. I meant what I said in the car, he said quietly, about wanting you here because you choose it, not because I'm paying for it. I know, I said, and my answer is still the same as it was in that hall. I'm staying. Even knowing Nathaniel isn't finished yet? Even knowing this world doesn't get gentler just because today went well? Especially knowing that, I said. I didn't survive the last week by accident, Victor. I survived it because I chose to stand my ground instead of running from it. That's not going to change now. Something settled fully behind his expression then. Relief and warmth intertwined so completely that for a moment, the careful, guarded man from that very first office meeting seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by someone far more human, far more real. Then I suppose, he said, we build whatever comes next together. Together, I agreed. Outside the bakery window, the city continued its ordinary evening rhythm, entirely unaware of the quiet transformation that had just taken place inside a small shop with terrible coffee and warm pastries, where a woman once hired for a single evening had become someone chosen for considerably longer, and a man once defined entirely by careful control had finally allowed himself to want something simply because it made him happier, rather than because it served any strategic purpose at all. As we finally stood to leave, the golden evening light spilling through the windows around us, I understood that whatever challenges Nathaniel Ashford or anyone else in that dangerous world still intended to bring, I would face them exactly the way I always had. Standing beside Victor, not beneath him. Equal, unafraid, and entirely unwilling, now or ever again, to be treated as anything less than exactly who I was. Weeks later, the fallout from that council meeting continued to ripple through the quiet, dangerous world I had stepped into so unexpectedly. Nathaniel's influence shrank steadily as the investigation into his connections deepened, former allies distancing themselves one by one, unwilling to risk their own standing by staying loyal to a man whose credibility had collapsed so publicly in front of the very people he once commanded respect from. Victor's position, by contrast, grew steadier with each passing week, the earlier doubts about his composure and control replaced by a quiet respect that hadn't existed before the gala. Council members who once watched him with cautious suspicion now greeted him with genuine warmth, several openly crediting the clarity of that meeting for restoring their confidence in his leadership. I found my own place shifting alongside his, no longer viewed as a temporary companion hired for appearances, but as someone whose presence carried real weight in that world, someone consulted rather than simply displayed. Adeline became a steady friend during those weeks, guiding me gently through the unwritten rules of a society I was still learning to navigate, her sharp wit and quiet wisdom proving invaluable more times than I could count. There were difficult days too, moments when the danger Victor had warned me about surfaced in small, unsettling ways, quiet threats delivered through intermediaries, tense conversations that reminded me clearly this world never fully softened, no matter how secure things appeared on the surface. But through each of those moments, I found myself standing steadier than I ever expected. The frightened woman who had opened her door to two strangers that first night, replaced permanently by someone who understood exactly what she was capable of. Victor and I built something neither of us had planned for in the beginning, something that started as a transaction and slowly transformed into partnership, then into something warmer still, something built on mutual respect earned through fire rather than convenience. He no longer needed to remind me not to flinch, because I simply didn't anymore, and he no longer needed to introduce me carefully to any room we entered together, because everyone who mattered already understood exactly who I was and exactly what I meant to him. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that folded piece of paper he slid across his desk during our very first meeting, the number that had once seemed like the answer to all my problems. It had solved far more than my rent that month. It had opened a door I never expected to walk through, into a life more dangerous, more complicated, and ultimately, more meaningful than the quiet, careful existence I had been living before. I don't regret opening my door that night to two strangers in dark suits. I don't regret stepping into that golden mansion, or standing my ground in that cold marble hall. Every difficult moment led me exactly here, standing beside a man who no longer needed to pretend with me, in a life I never could have predicted, but wouldn't trade now for anything resembling the quiet safety I once mistook for happiness. Some doors, once opened, simply refused to close again, and I have never been more grateful for one that didn't.